Yes, this talk is about a CSS framework that I'm fond of called Tailwind CSS. Sort of appropriate for PHP's group, I guess, because it sort of came from the Laravel PHP project. The guy who started it was very big in the Laravel community. But, yeah, got Adam one. Yeah, here's my name and my Twitter handle. So the same on Twitter and GitHub and Drupal.org and all these things. So, yeah, Oliver Davies pretty much everywhere. I didn't post the link in the chat to the slides, but I'll do that afterwards. They're all on Speaker Deck and embedded on my website and everything. So here's a little sort of image of my tech stack. I'm a long-time Drupal developer. I think it's 12 years or something now. I've been doing PHP and Drupal. I've been doing Symfony probably for about 5 years on some personal projects as well. Drupal 8 uses Symfony as well, in case anybody wasn't aware. I've been using some of the framework and some of the components on different projects as well as some other things like Vue.js and some static site generators. And I've done a little bit of WordPress as well. I did this talk for a WordCamp in the UK, I think maybe 2 years ago now. We've just changed years, right? So yeah, I try and find tools that I can work consistently across this stack, and Ansible being one and Tailwind probably being the other one. So that's quite nice to have consistent things that I can use across different projects, regardless of what it is I'm actually using. So what is Tailwind CSS? The website, at least the old version of their website, they just redid it when Tailwind 2 was launched. So hopefully this is still there. But it's a utility-first CSS framework for building custom designs. So the main things that jump out here for me are utility first. So it's a bit different to Bootstrap, where it's here's all this HTML, copy it, and then we've got a load of CSS that matches that HTML. Tailwind is pretty much the opposite. It gives you a load of classes, and it's up to you to write the markup that matches those classes. And they're all really small, low-level utility classes. So mostly they're one-to-one with the actual CSS rules and properties. It's written in PostCSS. The early versions were written, the early versions were written in less. So there's some features that sort of come across from less, but yeah, it's been PostCSS for the majority of its lifetime. So it's a PostCSS plugin you'd install if you're not sure or familiar with that. If you're familiar with auto prefixer, so it's something that will run after you compile your CSS and make changes to it. So auto prefix will add vendor prefixes. So if you're using, goodness me, it's been a while, -moz for Mozilla Firefox and -ms for Internet Explorer or whatever. So a bit different to Sass and less, which are pre-processors. So these are technically post-processors, post-CSS. One of the key things for me as well is the custom design. So because these classes are so low level, because you're not copying all this Bootstrap type markup or standard looking markup, no two Tailwind sites really look the same. That's maybe changed a little bit now. They've started releasing components as well. But yeah, we'll see some examples of that now. But there's not really a Tailwind looking. You can't really look at a site and go, oh yeah, that's Tailwind, in the same way you can and go, oh yeah, that's a Bootstrap website. So it's highly customizable. We'll take a look at how to configure it later on. It's just a JavaScript file where you plug your values in and it works. Everything's really low level. So when Adam was writing this, he found that he was copying and pasting this framework between projects. It wasn't a framework then, but he was just copying classes around between projects. And he found that the ones that he was copying most consistently were the really low level ones. So the panning classes and the spacing classes and the colors, rather than things like buttons and things that change project to project. It's really extendable. You can write custom plugins and write your own classes to plug into it as well. And because of the low levelness, it really avoids the need to name things up front, which is quite nice as well. Although you can extract components, which we'll see examples of in a minute as well. And one of the nice things as well, it comes in built with its own built-in design system. So there's a load of fonts and colors and padding and width and spacing and everything that's there for you. They've got a designer, or maybe two designers now, working on this team. So they've got a real sort of designer's eye looking at it, making these color palettes and things. So it's great to use out of the box, but also you can just plug in your own values. And yeah, if your project needs X, Y, and Z colors, you put those in and it generates the classes for you based on those colors. And you've got these constraints of the padding values and the fonts and the colors. So what you don't get is developer A making a thing that's green and the developer B making another thing that's very slightly different green. You probably couldn't tell by looking at it. But yeah, that still lives in your CSS. It's adding bloat. So being able to pick from a predefined list of colors and spacing makes your designs a lot more consistent, and your CSS is a lot smaller as well. So these are some of the things that Tailwind included in some of the earlier versions. So colors for text and borders and backgrounds, font size, font family and font weight, text alignment, padding, margin, negative margin, flexbox, grid, relative positioning, absolute positioning, Z indexes, opacity. Some of the newer things have been added in as screen reader visibility. So if you're using Bootstrap, then it's a SR only class. Drupal has a element visible class that does the same thing. Placeholder colors, you can target nth child, the third thing in this list or the first thing in this list. Grid, I said already, that was one of the most requested things in the framework prior to version 1 was CSS Grid utilities, as well as transforming and transitioning. Then additional things like spacing, which is really nice. You can just, rather than adding margin to individual elements, you can just say spacing, this much spacing, and on the parent, and also add the spacing between the children. So that was something I really liked from that main. And they're always adding these new things into this framework. So every time I do this talk, I have to go and add more stuff into these slides. Text clamping is one they added in quite recently. But yeah, there's a team of, I think, 4 or 5, maybe 6 people working on this project now full time. So yeah, they're getting through these new features at a good pace. So here's a screenshot of the site. This is the Laravel Nova homepage. This is built with Tailwind. As I said, it sort of came from the Laravel community, so it's very popular with Laravel-based sites. This is the Send Firefox site. This uses Tailwind as well. So there's no sort of common look between these two sites. They look quite different. And then anybody using Drupal, they should be quite familiar. This is the Bartik theme. This is Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 and Drupal 9's default theme, or at least a version of it. This is a clone that I did. So I've written all my own HTML and all my own CSS using Tailwind and a little bit of JavaScript. I think it took about an hour or 2 hours to do this. So yeah, it's pretty close. And yeah, if you're using Drupal, I like to think you probably will be able to tell the difference between that and the real thing. But yeah, again, I think this is just proving my point that it's not really a Tailwind looking site like the same way there is with the Bootstrap looking site. So how do we use it? Now we know that it is. So it's sort of the opposite workflow to probably what you used to when you're starting CSS, rather than writing classes in your HTML and then going to a separate style sheet and then writing a lot of styles in a separate style sheet. You add the classes that Tailwind gives you and add those directly to your HTML. So it's a little bit backwards. It looks really weird to begin with. Everybody has this initial sort of thing. Like, I don't like it. It looks weird. I don't like it. So everybody has it. But yeah, once you try it for a little bit, it really gets you some of the benefits of it. The sort of advantages sign through and you sort of get over the weirdness of it. Yeah, and because we're using these utility classes that Tailwind gives us, we're able to build these designs without writing any CSS or without writing very much custom CSS at all. So it really is trying to encourage you to work pretty much within your HTML, within your Twig or your Blade templates, and not have to keep switching back between files, which is really nice. So some of the benefits of this, you're not wasting time and energy inventing class names. There's some projects I've worked on where I've had to make like a sidebar left top inner wrapper or something, which is a really, I had to sit there and think, what is this? And I think this was using BEM, we got block element modifier. So I came to some really crazy class names. At the end of the day, it probably was just a flex container or something. So with Tailwind, we can just say flex and it's a flex container. So yeah, that saves, I didn't need to think of that crazy class name. I could just go flex, it's flex and it's done. I can move on. The CSS stops growing. So every time you add some new components to your site or add a new page or something, you're not going to start writing a load of new CSS to go along with that page. Because we're reusing the existing classes the Tailwind gives us, it's not actually, someone did a talk at DrupalCon and found a graph. I was meant to find it before I did this talk again, but it shows someone did a thing in their project and they could see like a graph of how much the CSS was growing over time, and they switched to utilities and actually sort of dropped down quite significantly, and then that continued to stay down and get smaller and smaller actually rather than growing. I need to find that for next time I do this. And then making changes feel safer because CSS is normally global. I've been there for sure where I'm going in and I need to change something to be a different color or different spacing or different font size. And I've got to worry, like if I change this, what else is going to get affected by me changing this? Because CSS is normally global. And what this is doing is bringing it into a local scope. So I can be confident that just changing that class from text blue 200 to text red 200 or whatever my change is, like it's only going to affect that thing that I'm actually changing. So that's nice as well. So here's some screenshots, some outdated screenshots. I think they've changed these as well when they did the site rebrand, but hey. Yeah, we can see here, this isn't the full animation thing, but yeah, enough to maybe get an idea of the workflow. So on the right here, we're building this little contact card. On the left, we can see the HTML. So we've got a H2 with the person's name and then the job title and their email address and their phone number. So there's no CSS, no custom CSS file here at all. So you can see there's a couple of classes here. So on line 1, we've got BG white and rounded LG. So that's BG is background and white is white. So we're setting a white background on this element. Rounded LG. So we're going to add some rounded corners. So you can't, maybe you can see it with the shadow. It's a bit difficult to see. So Tailwind typically either has a t-shirt sizing, like small, medium, large, extra large, like this rounded class here. The image has a H16 and W16, so there's a height and width, and then a value of 16. So either using the t-shirt scale, or we've got a numeric value here. So everything's 4 is the sort of baseline. 4 units is 1 rem, and everything is proportional from there. So 16 is 4 times more than 4, so it's 4 rem. I think my math is right there. But yeah, it's nice that everything's proportional. So if I want to say this needs to be double, I just double the number in the class, and it doubles the value behind the scenes as well. So moving on, if you want to add some padding to this card, we add a P class for padding and give it a value of 6. So yeah, 4 is 1 rem, so 6 is 1.5 rem. We want to make it rounded, so we're going to add rounded full. That just adds this 100% radius to make it circle. Which I think if they maybe change that to be radius 100, at least let's talk about it anyway. As well as P for padding, get M for margin, and then X for the x-axis, so left and right margin auto to move that image into the center. Text LG, so back to our t-shirt sizes again to make this text large. This one is text purple 500, So there's a scale of colors and shades of colors. So this is purple, and then 50 is the lighter shade, and then 900, I think, is still the darker shade. So this is a nice in the middle purple. And then we can make this text gray. So 600 grays and just slightly darker shade of gray. And then, yeah, we're going to put everything in the center. We just add text center to make everything text align center. So I think this is enough to sort of demonstrate the workflow. So we're only working inside this one HTML file here. So we're not flipping between HTML and style sheets. And yeah, this does go on. But yeah, I didn't want to sort of let the cat out of the bag here and give away some of the rest of the presentation. But yeah, I'd encourage you to go and take a look at the website, the Tailwind website, and look at the rest of this if you'd like to. My cup of tea is on the turn, just about to go cold. Lovely. So how do we install it? We have two options. The first is to use the CDN. So yeah, just pull in the CDN as a version as a style sheet and just add it into your project. That works. It's fine, I'd say, for sort of prototyping or just giving it a try. But to get the most out of using Tailwind, you should add it as an npm package. So how do we do that? We just run our npm install command. We add it as a dev dependency. There's some discussion around this on Twitter this week, whether it should be a dev dependency or not a dev dependency. I'm still not sure. There we are. So you can add it with npm or with yarn. It's available on npmjs.org or .com as a project. Just install it with npm. And this will add it to our package.json file as a dependency. Once we've added it as a dependency, we need to add it into our CSS. So we have this idea of a source file where the pre-post CSS version, that's really badly explained. Source file is where we're going to put our placeholders in. Then we're going to run post CSS, and then post CSS will generate the output file. Sorry, this will make more sense in a second. So here I'm going to be using a .pcss file, which is a post CSS file. So I typically just use post CSS now for most things. So given Tailwind is written with post CSS, I just started using it. And then any sort of extra features like nesting, like you'd sort of use in Sass, you can add extra plugins into post CSS for it. There's an advantage here that it only needs to then compile once. So you can use this with Sass or less, or whatever, the Stimulus or Stylus, the other one. So you could use those as well. It's not, you don't have to use post CSS for your input for your source file. But then you would have to compile your Sass first, put that into CSS, and then run post CSS on it. And so you have to sort of compile it twice. So yeah, I avoid that by just using post CSS. And I like using the .pcss extension just to show it's a post CSS file. And inside that file, we have three placeholders or Tailwind directives. So the first one is base. So there's just some reset styles here. So it pulls in, I think, normalize CSS and some other things just to make everything consistent across browsers. Then we have Tailwind components. So they have a container component. So it just adds a maximum width based on the screen size there. And then utilities, which are the main part of the framework, all the text colors and font spaces and sizing and everything. So that's the basic version. You can, of course, add your own styles in around this. This is probably the biggest mistake I've seen people doing, is people just tend to put the placeholders at the top and then add their own styles at the bottom. Because the way CSS works, you want your components to override your base styles, then you want your utilities to override your components. So you want to put them in that order. So if I have a button component, I'm going to put that in first. And then if I want to add, let's say I've baked in some a color into my button, I want to then override the color with utility. If I get my ordering wrong, then that won't work. So I want to make sure I put my custom styles after the appropriate part of the style sheet. There's also an option to use another directive called @layer, and we can just say here @layer components. So any custom components I put here will get automatically put into the right place. So I'm not sure when this was added, but I've started using it quite recently. Just make things a little bit cleaner, I guess. But there's also the advantage that if you're using purging, which we'll get onto later, and we're going to also enable purging for components, Tailwind and Purge will know this is a component and will strip it or not. So we have a source file. We don't need to process it, and then generate our output file. So one way we can do this is using a build command that Tailwind provides. Yeah, we can just run npx, which is the npm execute, I think. I'm not sure. Pretty sure that's what it stands for. That's what I think of it as. Tailwind build. Then we pass our source file, which is the file that we just saw, and then our output file. So I'm going to pipe the result into dist app.css. So post.css file goes in, or your SAS file or whatever goes in, and then CSS comes out. Yeah, here's a teeny tiny little snippet of that, of what actually comes out. So here are the text align classes I mentioned earlier. And these ones are like one rule or one style per class. So these are all text left is text line left, and center and right. Everything. And in fact, these are pretty readable, I think. I've used some other similar frameworks before, and maybe it would be TL for text left or TC for text center. And yeah, to me, that's just the right level of verbose and readable enough that I can scan it and see exactly what it does. So the build tool is fine. If you're going to start using JavaScript and other things in your project, you're probably going to want to use a tool like Gulp or Webpack. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to use the Webpack Encore plugin from Symfony. Yeah, you could use Gulp. I've used Laravel Mix before. There's a Laravel Mix plugin as well that we could use. But yeah, for the sake of this talk, I'll use Encore for this. So you can add that as a dependency as well. Just npm install @Symfony Webpack Encore. That'll add it to our package.json file as well. And then we need to configure it. So this is our Webpack config.js file. And let's see here, we're setting our output path and our public path to be /dist or dist/. Then our style entry is going to be our source file. So same source file path again we saw previously. And this is going to generate an app.css file because of the style entry is called app. And then we also need to enable the post.css loader for it to pass this post.css properly. And yeah, this is useful again if you are going to use any additional post.css plugins like nesting. You'll enable that as well. We need a post.css config file as well. So it's just a little JavaScript object, which is kind of an array of plugins. So in this case, we're just going to require Tailwind CSS here. So again, if you're using auto prefixer, we put it after this. For using post.css nested, we probably put it before. I think the ordering matters here. Yeah, this is just we just enable all of our post.css plugins. And yeah, we can use our npx encore dev command out to just run the Webpack command. And we can see here it's generated our app.css file, and it says it's a big app.css file. It's got all these classes in it. The Tailwind is generated for us. I think put 3 meg or 2 or 3 meg by default. So it's a lot of classes, and intentionally more than you're going to use, more likely. And yeah, then we can add it to our HTML. So here's an example, just in a flat HTML file. For Drupal, we'd add it to a theme library, or for Symfony, we'd be using an Encore helper here. But yeah, it's just an example of just a flat file. Just add a style sheet link here just to our compiled file, so the one inside our dist directory, not the one inside the source directory. Okay, so one of the common pieces of feedback we get, I see from people, is this just like inline styles? And granted, things like the text left, text center utilities are pretty much the same as writing inline styles. But interaction states are where we sort of start to bridge away from that. So by interaction states, I mean things like hover, focus, whether something is active or disabled or like that. So yeah, things we couldn't do with inline styles. So how do we use them? We have this format. And so we have the state, which is hover, focus, whatever. Then a separator, which is just a colon. We can configure that if we need to. If for some reason a colon doesn't work on your project, you could change it. I've never had a reason to, but you can. And then the class name. So any class, I'll asterisk that, we'll come back to that in a second, we can use just by adding a prefix to it. So yeah, if we want to change the text color on hover, we can just say hover colon text red 500. If we want to change our focus, we do focus text red 500. And the nice thing about this is that the class name stays intact. The class name doesn't change. We're just adding a prefix to it. So I'm skipping a little bit ahead here, but if you think of this, the Bootstrap classes where you've got col MD, col MD5 or whatever it is, like the state or the screen size is in the middle of the class. You've got to remember it could be a different class in that case. Whereas yeah, here the class stays the same, which I think is really nice. And this is how the CSS looks. So as long as we're escaping that colon in our hover class, then yeah, we can use the colon in our class names, which I didn't know until I started using Tailwind a long time, a few years ago. So yeah, you can just see it's just adding on dot hover, escaping the colon, then adding the selector at the end again. And then in our HTML, we just add our base class, which is text red 500 here. And then when we hover over this link, it's going to change the text to 800. So just make it a darker red as we hover over it. So again, yeah, we couldn't do this with an inline style. So I did say that we could prefix any class, which potentially is true, but not with the default config. So here's a preview of the default config from the Tailwind gives us, and there's a variance key here. And each of the classes are grouped into modules. They were called modules in an earlier version, or just groups of variants, I guess now. And you can see here that on the left is the name of the module or the variant group. On the right is the array of keys or the array of states we want them to be enabled for. So we can use the aligned content classes responsively. We can use background color on hover and focus as well. So they've given us a nice set of defaults that we can use, which sort of makes sense. Like you probably don't want to change the aligned content on focus, for example, but you know, you can if you want to. Yeah, I let this one out of the bag, I think, a little bit a second ago. But yeah, everything's also responsive. So in the same way we could add a state and then a separator in a class, we can also add a screen name and separator in a class. So another sneak peek at our default config. Here are some screens. So the screens are just breakpoints. And we have 4 of them. When I did these slides, there's actually 5 now. They've added a 2XL one by default now as a Tailwind 2. So these were, I think, the same as the Bootstrap ones now. They used to be slightly different and they were changed just before Tailwind 1 was released. So yeah, we can define these. Again, if you want different breakpoints for your project, you can change them or you can remove them or add more if you want to. And yeah, these are all minimum width breakpoints, which we'll get to in a second as well. But yeah, we use them in the same way as we use the interaction state. So we just add MD colon flex if we want something to be display flex on medium screens. And we can chain them as well. So we can have we can change the color of something when we hover over it when we're on a medium screen or above. So, which is pretty cool. Yeah, as I said, these are all minimum width breakpoints, so they're all mobile first by default. So any classes that you add are there for the your mobile phones or your small screen sizes, and then any SM colon class will override the default one. Again, they don't have to be. If your project wants to use maximum width, or you want to add like a range, or you can add some really cool custom variants and things as well. Yeah, you can configure that in your project. So yeah, here's an example. So we've got 2 columns here, and everything we're using display block by default, which is the default anyway. But on medium screens, we want it to be display flex. So we're going to display, rather than being on top of each other, we'll display them side by side. And then each column has a width full, so 100% width. And then on medium screens, because we've got the MD prefix, it's going to be width 1/2. And this is quite nice as well. I like that it says width 1/2 rather than width 50 or something. It's just, yeah, just verbose enough for me just to be able to figure out what's going on, which is nice. So yeah, how do we customize it? We could use the npx tailwind command again and run init, and that will initialize a new config file for us. So this is the default config file as a Tailwind 2. And yeah, it's just another JavaScript object in a tailwind.config.js file. And yeah, if anybody's used Tailwind, like the early versions, it gave you everything in the config file, and you were responsible for managing everything, like all the variants, all the colors. Yeah, everything. And then you weren't able then to easily get any updates that came in a new version. You have to go to the diff and then, oh, you've added these new classes or these new variants or whatever. So yeah, the nice thing about this now is it takes the default config that we sort of saw earlier on and then merges this file over the top of them. So this file is just for your overrides and your customizations. So let's see here. Yeah, the interesting thing here is just look at the theme key here. The theme key is where we define all of our colors and text sizes and everything. So if I want to add a new color called inherit, because I do sometimes use inherit, we can just add a colors key and add. On the left here is the name of the class that we'll use that will get added. On the right is the value. So in this case, they both happen to be inherit. And then colors will also be used for background colors, text colors, border colors, everything else by default. Due to the placement here, so we're adding it directly into the theme object. So this will override all of the colors that Tailwind's going to generate. So we'll only have one color left if we do this, which is fine. If you've got a design from a designer or from a marketing agency or something, here is your color palette. We're going to use this red and this green and this blue. Then yeah, just put in the colors that you're going to use, and then Tailwind will only generate colors that match that color palette for you. If you did want to extend them, there's also an extend key. So just moving colors into extend. And because it's in the extend key, it will extend the default color scheme. So it'll add it on top of Tailwind's default ones, if that's what you want to do. So there are a couple of additional things that aren't in the default config file. So important can be true or false. If you want to add the exclamation mark important to all the classes, you can just say true and it will do that for you when it generates them. That's probably fine actually for utility classes, I think, because if you add a utility class to something, you want it to work. Yeah, there's our prefix, which is an empty string by default. So if you're using, sometimes I've put Tailwind on top of Bootstrap or on top of Bulma or another framework. So yeah, if you did want to avoid any potential clashes, you can just prefix everything. So typically it tends to be like TW dash of Tailwind dash block Tailwind dash text color red. I have had an issue, no, not an issue, but I was aware that Drupal 7 has a block class for its blocks, and then Tailwind also has a block class for display block. So there's a base theme or a starter kit theme that I maintain. And I'm working on client projects. I do prefix them there, but in Drupal 8 and 9, I've not had that problem. Yeah, it's good to know that you can do that. And then our separator, again, if the colon doesn't work in your project, or you want to use a triple underscore or something for your project, you can do that. If you did want the full version, you could just add -- full. It will give you the full config file, and you can manage and everything yourself. So, as I said earlier, Tailwind is going to give you a lot of CSS. I think it's 2 or 3 meg now. And if you enable everything, it's probably considerably more than that. But there are some approaches here to sort of maintain that size. So we can go in and we can disable any variants that we're not using, or any core plugins that we're not using. So this is our variants list again. It's our default variant list. And let's say we're not going to use certain things. So if we're not going to use align self at all, we can remove the array and just say false. It won't generate any align self classes at all. Let's say we're only going to use background color responsively. So we're not going to change that on hover and focus. We can just remove them from the array, and it won't generate those classes either. We can also manually remove classes that we're not going to use, that we're not going to want. So here's our screen config and some colors on our project. And let's say we're not going to use the XL breakpoint on this project. So we can just remove it. And again, it just won't generate any classes with an XL prefix. And yeah, let's say we're not going to use these 2 shades of gray, just remove them and they won't get generated. So this is quite nice. Some advantages to this, that if it's not going to generate any classes, then people won't be tempted to use them. So yeah, we're just adding those constraints and keeping in line with our design style guide or design system, token system, whatever it's called. Yeah, we only make available the colors that we want people to actually use. Yeah, especially screens, because if you're not going to use a 2XL breakpoint, for example, it's going to not generate like 1/5 of the size of the CSS. We also have the option to automatically remove any classes that we don't use. So there's a library called Purge CSS. Tailwind has been sort of an advocate of using it for some time, and it's been included as sort of a first class option since 1.4, I think. But yeah, these two work very well together, because Tailwind gives you too much CSS by default, and then Purge CSS's job is to go through and remove anything that you just basically don't use. So back in our Tailwind config again, we have a purge key, and the most basic format of this is just an array, and it's an array of paths we want Purge CSS to look at. So this is going to be our HTML or our twig or our view or our blade PHP templates or whatever. And then when we run Tailwind build in the production mode, it's going to scan those templates, compare that with the CSS and say, did we use TextRed 500? No, then remove it from our CSS. So we only get the CSS we've actually used in our template. Yeah, there's a couple of other things I had to look at. And on my side, I've got some occasional class in some block body content. So I export all my Drupal config into YAML files, which is pretty common for Drupal 8 and Drupal 9 projects. So I scan that to make sure I've got everything from there. Yeah, I feel a bit. So yeah, it's going to depend on your project, really. So if you're going to want to generate everything, we run encore dev or npm run dev or mix dev or whatever the equivalent is for Laravel mix. I forget. So this will tell you just generate everything. And then if you want to have a production version, so we just have, if you want to purge out or run the purge and remove everything we didn't use, then we can run encore prod and set the node environment to production, and that will trigger the purge setting inside Tailwind. Okay. Another question I get is how do I deal with repetition? So I've got all of these classes, particularly for say buttons. I don't want to have to add the same classes for every button, for example. Tailwind suggests extracting components, primarily HTML components, so twig partials, or same for Drupal, but WordPress has the concept of template parts. I believe that's the term, or Vue and React have their own components as well. Something I usually ask is, does something justify being a component? So like a nav bar, I'm only going to have one nav bar. So I'd probably not move that into a component unless I'm doing it for purely readability purposes. But yeah, if there's only one of it, then in my mind, it doesn't need to be componentized. Yeah, essentially what we're talking about is moving duplication elsewhere. So rather than having 50 instances of one button, we're going to want to extract one component, or maybe use a loop, and just have one version, one instance, so that, well, removing duplication, but only having one instance of those classes anywhere. So yeah, a couple of twig examples here. So first we can use loops. So just have an array of nav items. I think this is my sculpting site, I think, a couple of versions of my site ago. Yeah, we're just going to loop over some nav items and generate some links. Put in the URL and the title in the right place. But the key thing here is we could have 10 links, or we could have 100 links or 1,000 links. But because we're using a loop, we've only actually got one instance of this string where we're adding a block, py3, px4, whatever. So if we wanted to change this, we could just change it here in one place. And then when we're going to recompile our templates again, it's going to update for every link. So because we're using the loop, we've got no more duplication. Even though you might look at the, do a view source on the project, you might see, oh, there's 20 of these links on a page. In our templates, you've only got one. Another opportunity to use includes. So here's a screenshot from the Jiu-Jitsu school site that I was building at the time. And just one of two sets of class. There's a timetable page. So yeah, all the adult classes at the top, all the kids classes at the bottom. Extracted the list markup into an include called class list, and then just pass through the classes and the type dynamically. So all the static markup has stayed the same inside one partial, and just pass through the dynamic stuff. So again, we've only got one instance of this class list. So if you wanted to change both lists at the same time, we could just do that inside our one template. If we need to, we can still extract CSS components. So this is something that did come from the less pre-processing functionality. That natively allows you to use classes as mix-ins. So you could just have dot whatever, and it would just build it for you. So we can do the same here with @apply. And again, any class that we would have used in markup, we can just say @apply class name. And when it compiles, it will generate the styling it would have had by adding the class to it. And as of the new version, I think since Tailwind 2, we can do it with pseudo classes as well, so things like hover : So in earlier versions, we had to have had a.btn : hover as a separate rule, and then to @apply bg blue 700. Yeah, now we don't need to do that, and just makes everything a little bit cleaner. So yeah, if we were to run that, then this is what we get. It just takes let's say the styling it would have added by adding the class, it just puts it into our actual button, CSS button component. Also, there's our hover state. Moving on to the next slide. Nice. So let's say, yeah, we can add it. We can extend plugins. So plugins as well are just npm packages. So here's one that I wrote. It's called Tailwind List Reset. So this was a class that was added and removed before 1.0, but I was using it in some projects, so I decided to make a little plugin for it. Add it through npm, and let's add it to our plugins array in our Tailwind config file. This is the CSS that this plugin generates. It's not particularly crazy, but yeah, I was using it on some projects, so I wanted it to be there. Just removes the list styling and the padding on the, this is the default now, but at the time it wasn't. And yeah, this is how I write this plugin. So it's an index.js file, and Tailwind gives us some functions we can use, like add utilities and add variants. Then we write a CSS and JS type syntax and pass through the variants at the end here. So we define the variants in the config file, and it will build them based on it. So yeah, real sort of simple example. I've got some more complex ones on GitHub if people want to check them out. Yeah, this is just a way of extending Tailwind if you want to reuse this class on multiple projects. So I'll do a little bit of demo. Obviously, I've been talking for a little while already, but do this little demo here. So rather than building everything from scratch, this is what I did for one of the UK PHP groups last year. So I quite like this one. This is my clone of the Symfony.com site. So you'll find it on GitHub. It's just in rebuilding Symfony on GitHub. And this is it's a static HTML page built with Tailwind. So yeah, if you check that out later on if you like. This is the actual Symfony.com webpage. I didn't do the whole thing, but I done part of it. So if I flip over to this site now, so yeah, this is built with HTML written from scratch and then just Tailwind. So it's pretty close, I think. Yeah, and then it's responsive as well. So if I just use the little Chrome plugin here, we can see that it resizes stuff to be responsive. Yeah, if I just move it here, you can see the little cloud SVG. Oh, wait a minute. So yeah, no cloud SVG, and then we'll just get to breakthrough. Yeah, there comes the little cloud SVG. So here's an example. There's some interesting stuff in here. I'm also using like a dark mode here. This is before it's been added to Tailwind, like now as an actual option. But this is done with a custom media query. So if I change the background for my OS settings here, it'll change the background of the site as well, which is pretty cool. So yeah, that's something that's available there as an option. You can do it using a class as well in the newer version, but in this one, it's all done through that setting and using the sort of media query. And actually, yeah, GitHub's changed as well. So there's some interesting sort of stuff in here. The other things I grabbed from Symfony here are the little images, and let me just show you the Tailwind config file really quickly. So yeah, I've got some purge settings here. So it's just looking at that one HTML file, and then looking at that for classes to use. Here are the colors. So I've just grabbed the colors off the Symfony website and then completely overridden them. So yeah, some interesting sort of numbers in here. Yeah, overriding the font families. Again, custom media query here. So overriding screens and adding one for dark. So everything is dark : something, and that's tagging into this prefers color scheme media query. Just see anything else that's sort of worth showing here. Oh yeah, there's some interesting stuff in here as well. Adding in some base classes. So just doing some text link styling here using apply. So my custom base styling, then some Tailwind components, and then I've extracted a nav item here. This is using the nested plugins to be able to nest these. I need to refactor some of this because I could now do apply LG colon text XM. So I need to go back and do that. And I have added a couple of filter contrast classes here as well. So this is what the website is using for recoloring the logo when you switch from light to dark. Let's do some contrasting on the SVG. So this is the other way of extending Tailwind, adding your own classes to it. You just add them here. And then @responsive will generate the responsive versions of it as well. Let's see, let's have a quick look at this HTML. I'm just going to mention this because people can always look at this later on if they'd like to. But yeah, here I'm using the dark filter invert 100. So yeah, that's changing that logo color. Some places here we're doing this SVG shows up on mobile and then we're hiding it on medium screens. And we have another version that is hidden by default and that appears on medium screen using block display block. I'm using some grid stuff in here. So yeah, some CSS grid things for layouts, which is quite nice. There's the spacing utility that I mentioned. So that will add a space Y, so top and bottom spacing of 16, sort of 4, 8, 12, yeah, 4M. Again, yeah, I can jump between projects and sort of not look at this for a few months like I have and go, yeah, this is text large and leading tight and it's Georgia and it's I can do that. Whereas normally with other projects done in a sort of traditional CSS approach, I'd get lost quite quickly. It's probably fair to say. And yeah, if I needed to change a background color, I could be quite happy to go in and change this one to be red or whatever and be quite confident that it's not going to break anything else. So I've done a few of these actually. Actually, I think I've grouped them all onto my site here. Yeah, have a quick look. Yes, UIs I've rebuilt here. Yes, I've done a few. This is the Baltic one. I've done some. I did one of the WordPress core themes for the WordCamp as well. But yeah, I quite like doing rebuilding something that's sort of applicable to the audience I'm doing this talk. So that's that. Yeah, okay. And yeah, as I said, it looks really strange at the beginning, like all these classes and people say it looks ugly and it's not semantic and everything. This was somebody who someone saw me do this talk at the WordCamp. And we had a bit of a discussion afterwards about why it wasn't very good. And yeah, into it. But yeah, like I said, just try it for like a week or something. You did. And yeah, this was his reply to the Tailwind account itself, which I found, which was pretty cool. So yeah, always nice to get people who were a little bit skeptical, maybe, or a bit nervous about it at first, giving it a try and enjoying it, which is the same. I had exactly the same thing. I remember watching the first time Adam was showing this sort of approach. He was building a different project, like a Laravel-based project, and started building CSS this way. I looked at it and went, oh, that's not how I write CSS, skip. And then sort of came back to it a few times later and sort of started appreciating it. Some links here. So yeah, Tailwind CSS is the framework, the open source framework. Tailwind UI is the paid for component library, which is how they're able to pay for their staff members. They made a lot of money off this project. It's a one-time purchase for lifetime access, which is pretty cool. And there's a starter kit theme that I maintain for Drupal projects, which is pretty cool. And yeah, before I forget, I'm doing a workshop, I think next Thursday, the 18th, for Drupal Camp Florida, which is online. So it's like a 3-hour or 4-hour workshop into Tailwind. So yeah, maybe I don't know if people want to find out more, then that's happening next week.